He spoke in a language meant to humiliate her. The Don's voice cut through the low hum of Ristorante Bellavita like a sharp knife through silk, smooth, practiced, laced with a regional cadence that made the staff straighten in their aprons. At the long, polished table near the back, a man in a dark suit and a watch that cost more than a car leaned forward and gave his order. He did not speak to the waiter. He spoke through the waiter. He spoke in Neapolitan. Brief, clipped phrases rolled from his lips with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to making people small. "Porta o piatto ci sono pure I cani," he said, the words falling like pebbles, half culinary command, half contempt. The young server at his side repeated it for the room. "Bring him the plate. Make sure she understands." The intent was clear. The Don wanted a display, an orchestrated embarrassment. In that sentence there was the assumption that that waitress, Zora Williams, black, 32, named in neat black letters on a cheap plastic tag pinned above the left breast of her plain shirt, would flounder at anything Italian that wasn't on the printed menu. Zora felt every eye in the dining room flick toward her name tag. There was an edge to the lighting, fat globes that threw satin bright pools over white tablecloths, and now those pools felt like interrogation lights. She held a tray of water glasses for a beat longer than necessary, and let the tray hover between her palms, feeling the coolness of the glass against her skin. The restaurant's lemon-scented oil simmered in the air, the pepper grinder coughed, silverware chimed. Ordinary sounds, ordinary and suddenly loaded with audience. She smiled in the way servers must, an economy of warmth that keeps dishes moving. But it was a practiced gesture pressed on an interior that had to decide whether to curl, to fold, to disappear. 3 seconds passed. Then 5. The Don's smile widened at her stillness like a predator enjoying an animal that didn't yet know it was dead. If you love twists where the underestimated win, like and subscribe. The order hung between them, supposed to have the taste of power, the unmistakable flavor of, "We are above you." The waiter hesitated, translating the regional bite of the Don's words for a room suddenly turned stage. The owner, a man with too much hair product and a custom jacket, rubbed his hands together behind his back and mouthed the name of the special, beseeching, as if smoothing over a rift. For Zora, the moment was a calculation, not a panic. She felt the cheap pin of her name tag, the engineered papery flaps of tip receipts in her back pocket, the pulse of worry for the two things that kept her tethered to this dining room. Her mother's medical bills and her younger brother's looming tuition. Those facts came like cold pennies in a pocket, heavy, audible. Her mother, Lorraine, had been in the hospital 3 times in the last 18 months. Insurance gaps, a misdiagnosis, cobbled bills. These things had a gravity. Her brother, Malcolm, 19 and stubborn, and halfway through his first semester of community college, had been counting on her to cover the next payment. Zora kept a ledger in her head now, where every plate she handed out was a line item toward keeping the stitches of their life from unraveling. But there was another ledger she kept too, years older, inked in different handwriting. A life where Zora knew how to read the cadence of a speech, the cadence of a contraband shipment, the cadence of a man who felt entitled to put someone beneath him at a table. She had worn suits and been taken seriously in rooms that smelled of coffee and paper and strategy. She had briefed people who worked in places with titles like secretary and undersecretary. She had read cable traffic in the middle of the night, translated intercepted chatter, taken shorthand of criminal networks. A scandal, an ambiguous screw-up, whispers of loyalty and a smear that stuck, had severed that path and pushed her into a life where her fluency mattered only when she overheard tourists arguing over train times. The Don's words were meant to be a show. He would speak in a dialect that few at the table understood, command, and watch the humiliation land like a net. That was the performance. What he did not account for was the woman whose hands had once held briefing files and diplomatic pouches, who had sat behind glass in consulates and listened to smug men confess through translators. He did not account specifically for the way language can be a weapon when wielded by someone who has spent a lifetime turning it into maps of other people's secrets. The waiter stepped forward, lowering his voice as if reciting a prayer. He didn't complete the intended humiliation. The Don's pleasure had already bloomed elsewhere. Zora kept her smile measured. Her fingers curled around the tray, her breath readied to be the first move. In a near-soundless thread of voice, she answered. "Capisco benissimo," she said, the words sliding out in a clean, native smooth Italian that came not from a tour guide phrasebook, but from long nights in Sicily, passaports, and municipal registries. The syllables were proper, not clipped into the Don's regional consonantation, but precise, and the effect on the room was immediate. Conversation dipped. A fork stopped mid-air. The Don's expression tightened for a second, then widened into something else. Surprise, which had not yet been on his table. "Scusa?" one of his men asked the waiter, unsure. Zora smiled again, but this one was different, sharper, like a blade polished. She set the water tray down without breaking eye contact. "You asked me for the special with sofrito and induja. The house makes it with a generic spread. If it's the Calabrian induja, you mean, it should be the Spilinga smoke, not the vacuum-packed blend. You don't want the store-bought over the maker. The texture is wrong. It gums the pasta. And the wine you like." She tilted her head, a small inventory of braids and cufflinks. "The 2011 from the small cooperative outside Vibo Valentia. Don't decant it with the Chianti on the table. It will suffocate." She delivered it not as argument, but as fact. A string of regional detail, culinary judgments, and a specific wine pedigree that had to be known to be spoken with such casual inevitability. She had named a town the Don had not expected her to know, a brand of smoke he liked on his tongue, small, personal, precise. The table was a held breath. The watch flashed as the Don lifted his hand to his mouth and then lowered it like someone trying to hide a grin that had been surprised out of shape. There was a silence in the room that was a kind of unmasking. The Don's cronies blinked and found mirrors of discomfort where their laughter had been choreographed. The waiter, who had been ready to perform the Don's humiliation, looked embarrassed to have been called to facilitate what was turning into his own embarrassment. The owner's jaw worked behind his fingers. The bellhop's face flushed. "Did you?" someone tried. The Don's voice was a low thing, trying to retake center. "Yes," Zora said, and that single syllable sounded like a verdict. "Yes, I know. I used to handle imports for the embassy. I shipped cheeses, cured meats, legal paperwork. Sometimes people asked for favors. Sometimes they sent things through. You like the Spilinga because of the smoke, not the packaging. It marks you." Her answer did not shout. It threaded into the Don's table the uncomfortable idea that this woman who wiped down the bottles at the end of the night had, at one time, worked in the vocabulary of his pleasures. It was more intimate than shouting. It implied an ability to read him where other people only admired his suit. For a brief, dangerous second, Zora saw a flicker of something in the Don's face she had seen before, in other men who'd tried to own rooms. Recognition of a threat that was not physical but delicate. The kind of threat that comes when someone realizes their habits have left fingerprints. He had expected a performance of superiority. He was given, instead, proof she could see into his life. He froze the way predators do when their prey looks back. The Don's laugh tried to come out, short, brittle. He tossed an Italian phrase offhandedly that translated roughly to, "She practices too much," and the effort at humor landed flat, because for the first time in a long time his effect had misfired. Zora's retort had not been a challenge to his money or his muscle, but to his audience. He had been unmasked in front of people who fed on his power. That small humiliation was a bruise he would not press into the skin. He would try to reassert, to mask. He leaned forward, voice low and lacquered. "What's your name, ragazza?" he asked in Italian. It was a question that felt like ownership disguised as curiosity. "Zora," she answered plainly. He held her name as if testing its weight. "Zora, do you work here?" "Yes." The waiter wanted to move things along. He tried to offer a decoy, a laugh, a new dish, and the Don waved it away, irritated that his show had been watered down into something less elegant. Now his pride had been pricked, and irritation breeds sharper edges. "You should be careful with things you don't understand," the Don said in a voice that tried to combine supplication and threat. He spoke again in the regional lilt, a sentence meant to be layered. Not only did he intend to humiliate her now, but he wanted to signal to the room that he could make consequences. Reign. "We are people who prefer order. We don't like surprises." Zora measured her next breath. She could have walked away. 1,000 good reasons for silence threaded through her mind. She thought of Lorraine with her fever dreams and phone calls that ended in long, ragged breaths. She thought of Malcolm's stubborn grin when he'd taken a job on campus to cover last month's bill. She considered the ledger of little humiliations she had paid with cool hands, the invisible ledger that insisted she remain pliant if the family was to be kept whole. She had been trained to weigh risk, to spot the long arc of consequence in a room. This man was dangerous. She did not seek to humiliate him. She sought a way to be safe and to carve something back for the life she had been pushed out of. Her answer would not be a scream. It would be precise. "I know a man who only drinks that wine if it's been bottled by the family on the coast," she said, quiet enough for only the nearest clusters to hear. "He likes it because it reminds him of a port his father refused to sell. He brags about the smell of the sea and the salt. He pays a premium to keep that memory inside the bottle. And he hates people who mistake smoke for authenticity. He hates being lied to." The Don's hand tightened on his chair. The server who had brought the menu looked as if the world had turned slightly off axis. From the corner of the room, a man with a coat like a geography of decades watched. He had a small notebook and a face that had been weathered by long hours in interrogations and protocol briefings. He sipped his espresso slowly, the way someone drinks to remain observant. He knew the Don's type. He also knew the woman at the center of the room. The man, Elias Hart, had been a senior officer in a different life. He'd worked with Zora once on a case that tied shipping manifests to shell companies. He recognized the measure of her posture without needing to place the name. He had been watching, cataloging small things, an expensive cufflink with a ship's rosette, the Don's silent hand signals, the waiter's nervous smile. He had been compiling a case of his own for months against a small constellation of men who thought they were untouchable because they sat in rooms where power was measured by the width of a cuff. Elias hesitated for a beat. Too long to be pure coincidence, too short to be a mistake. And then he placed his cup down with the care of a man about to step into a ring. The Don's voice slid into a threat on its way down the sentence. He said, casually, that men like him keep people in their place. He said it as if he were documenting fact. People like you should remember where the knives are. It was a threat dressed as folklore, an undercurrent that suggested he could make life harder than a few sharp words. The room's temperature leaned toward panic. The owner's shoulders drew up as if someone had pulled at the collar of his jacket. Zora felt the sentence as the small storm it was, implied menace against someone whose day depended on keeping her job. She could lose this, and with it the few monthly guarantees that paid for Lorraine's prescriptions. But she also knew that violence was not what would save her, nor would it be what stopped a man who thought his threats were weapons. She had seen how institutional friction could turn a table over time if you knew the right edge to set it on. That was where Elias Hart moved. He stood and crossed the room, with the evenness of a man who had practiced being unflappable for a lifetime. He did not speak loudly. He did not swagger. He placed a palm lightly on the edge of the Don's table and introduced himself in measured English. "Mr. Moretti, Elias Hart, former consular liaison. Fancy seeing you here." The Don's men watched, evaluated whether Elias was a threat. But Elias's voice carried a different currency. The currency of reference, of contacts that could make smiles disappear in rooms beyond this one. Elias's hand was a small lever. He spoke to the Don with the politeness of a man who could make polite phone calls that mattered. He noted, with the casual precision of a man dropping a match into a pile of tinder, that he had been following certain shipments along the Italian coast and that he'd be very interested in knowing the Don's sources for village-produced goods. He made the phrase sound like idle curiosity. The implication was not lost. Men with the Don's habits prefer to avoid curiosities that smell like subpoenas. Zora watched Elias and calculated. He had been the one she had once sent cables to from a little consulate office in Sicily. He'd been a name in her files, a type of man who could arrange a meeting with a task force if he cared to. Now he was here, in a city where institutional muscle could be applied if coaxed right. The Don smiled his practiced smile. "We can talk," he said, soft as velvet. He had not meant for the man to have the kind of access Elias suggested, but he also knew how to behave in the presence of a man who had been inside the very system that had once protected him. Elias did not push. He slid a slim card across the table with the easy civility of someone making a social connection and the weight of someone who could make calls. "Call me," he said quietly, "and tell me the name of your importer." The Don's men were used to people who made them fear. They were not used to people who could threaten them legally with a casual phrase or a card. There was a murmur of intimidation replaced by calculation. The Don accepted the card because refusing it would read like an insult where none needed to be given. But he did not break his stare from Zora with the comfort of a man who'd been unchallenged. He was measured again, reasserting the posture of the man in control. After a tense exchange, the table relaxed, but not entirely. The Don folded the card into his palm like a thing to be catalogued. He rose at last, muttered something about evening plans interrupted, and left with his men, their exit a satin-sheened exodus of men who thought themselves untouchable. The room breathed. The owner slumped and offered Zora a shaky grin that tried to be gratitude but tasted like relief. Waiters went back to clearing. Yet the room's air had changed. The maneuver had gone from spectacle to something with teeth. People whispered. The manager said under his breath and with a queasy laugh, "You handled him well." Zora felt like she had been stood in the middle of an invisible battlefield and told to perform something. Her hands were shaking slightly, but it was not the same shake a trapped animal makes. It was a physiology in which the catalyzing adrenaline was fading, and the taste of victory was not yet realized. She had reclaimed a sliver of dignity, and while it didn't pay a bill yet, a path had been opened. The Don's reaction that evening was not the end of the story. It was a hinge. In the days that followed, Elias Hart made calls. He mentioned the Don's name to a contact at an interagency task force assembled to track money that moved through small port towns and artisanal brand goods. That task force had been built over years, not days. A convergence of Homeland Security, FBI, and a few entrenched consular contacts who knew how to untangle paperwork that crossed oceans. The way Elias phrased his interest was not dramatic. He brought up, in one short conversation, that a man who enjoyed Spilinga's smoke had a shipping manifest that did not match the customs declaration. He mentioned that the Don's companies had a proclivity for paying cash into accounts that sat in unassuming banks, and that occasionally other anomalies aligned. Real estate purchases listed under dissolved entities, cash gifts with no apparent source. Those phrases are the levers of a bureaucrat, precise, dry, and able to be turned. The task force did what task forces do. They opened folders, cross-checked invoices, subpoenaed ledgers. They were not thunderbolts. They were a paper arc that could become a net. They pulled manifests. They traced invoices. A few days later, a subpoena quietly arrived at the postbox of a front company the Don had used to buy a pair of property developers. The affidavit listed shipments tied to a seafood company and a series of shell invoices that made money look like fish, and the fish look like money. When the summons came, it was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no men in masks dragging him out of his chair. Instead, there was a formal letter, served at his lawyer's office. That letter required that he appear to give statements about financial practices that raised red flags. The title of the game, legally speaking, is Patient Paperwork and Patient Coverage. The Don's men frowned and started counting contingencies. The Don himself kept his face calm, but within the set of his face there was that same delicate recognition of being seen. Zora found out about the summons the way ordinary people do, through gossip and the small shuffle of news. Elias called her and said he had done what she could not have done on her own. He had leveraged his Rolodex and the file he had been building for years into an avenue for scrutiny. "You made him show his hand," he said. Sometimes people freeze not because they're shocked, but because they realize someone has a ledger. Zora accepted being drawn in as a liaison to the investigators. It was not a job with a title on LinkedIn, nor was it an overnight reinstatement to the life she had lost. It was work that involved sitting across from federal agents and translating passages of Italian, regional speech patterns, nicknames, roots with local nicknames for docs, and confirming details she had never meant to broadcast on a waiter's shift. She met with attorneys and consular officers and gave them the small précis of what had happened that night. The dialect used, the supplier names, the offhand things one man says that get repeated in hallways. The investigation was not a movie montage of arrests. It was calls and subpoenas and a few quiet encounters in which an investigator knocked on a door and asked questions about payment flows. The money trail was messy, as money trails often are. But the small things lined up. Shipments that had been declared as artisanal food items but were actually packing containers for more lucrative cargo, invoices that did not match weight. The investigators moved in the same indirect but relentless way Elias had modeled. Importantly, Zora's role was credible because of her background. She had been a diplomatic security analyst who had worked language into leverage, a job that had demanded a knowledge of dialect, of couriers, and of customs paperwork. Her ability to identify the peculiar phrasing the Don used was not parlor trickery, but a competence that could be put on a page and stand in a legal deposition. Her presence lent the investigators a piece of translation they needed, not just the words, but the social grammar behind them. The Don reacted to the summons with a series of maneuvers typical of men, used to the soft coercion of money and influence. He attempted to smooth relations through lawyers, offered reassurances that his companies were legitimate, and sent a quiet emissary to the restaurant to buy some good press in the local papers. But the mere fact of being summoned tied him up in a bureaucratic choreography that ate at his leisure. It cost him time and the virtue of invisibility. What had been a comfort to him was now a spotlight of harmless-looking but lethal paperwork. There were no dramatic handcuffs, no public shaming. The machinery of law and diplomacy worked slowly. Zora, who had been teetering on the edge of poverty, suddenly had a different arc. The investigators needed a liaison who understood the cultural nuance behind the phrases and the context that gave them meaning. She translated not only language but cultural cues, why certain phrases signaled a supplier, why a specific wine bottle meant a past intimacy to a man of his background. Her insights helped the agency tie a man's indulgences to his companies, and those connections gave the task force the leverage to file injunctions that prevented certain transfers of money and freeze some properties while inquiries followed. As the legal net tightened, the Don's options narrowed. He shifted from a posture of casual menace to a posture of legal defense. Men who had believed themselves above consequence discovered that consequences arrived as letters and investigations, and the kind of slow attrition that takes a man's power in places where it had once been absolute. They found the public theater they had used to intimidate was less effective when someone with the right references and the right patience chose to insist on paperwork. The changes were not immediate for Zora. There were still shifts where she cleared plates and kept an eye on Lorraine's upcoming appointments. There were meetings with investigators that required her to take time off from a job that would not always hold her hours. But the arc gradually bent in the direction she needed. The task force, with Elias's quiet pressure, moved documents that allowed an attorney to negotiate a modest stipend for Lorraine's unreimbursed bills through a program that supported victims of financial crime. Programs not flashy, but effective. Malcolm's tuition, once a looming cloud, was written into a payment plan that came with a small grant, and Zora found that the ledger she had kept in her head suddenly had lines that read like relief. Her role as a liaison did more than relieve bills. It gave her the small, tangible dignity she had been fighting for. She was consulted. People listened when she translated a phrase of dialect that introduced a supplier name, and the way those translations were logged in official reports felt like her old life, repurposed. The calm she had worn that night became a competence that could be measured and used. And there was a quiet triumph in how the Don's power had been undone, not by a chair thrown, not by violent spectacle, but by paperwork and patience. Men who think power is a display find their tents collapsing when institutions quietly move in the background. That's the art of accountability. The Don would later find that his lawyer would advise him to avoid certain purchases and that courts required him to appear. There would be fines, perhaps restraining orders, and the sort of professional discomfort that eats at a man's ability to assert social dominance. The restaurant staff never quite said it outright, but the air between the waiters and the owner shifted. They treated Zora with a different respect, quiet, practical. Tips improved a touch. The owner stopped offering her the least desirable shifts. The man who had once smoothed his hair in nervous panic began to treat her with a cautious civility. In ordinary places, small things are often the only currency people have. In the months that followed, Zora's life did not become a headline overnight. It became, instead, a series of small, sensible corrections. Lorraine's calls were fewer and steadier. The nights in the emergency room grew rare. Malcolm's tuition payments came with a pattern that allowed him to focus and not worry through every class. Zora took a temporary contract position with a federal liaison office that needed someone who could translate regional Italian and understand the small cultural cues that make a case's margins visible. It was not the role she had imagined in her youth. No cushy title with golden letters. But it was work that paid, that used the parts of her she had tried to hide, and it had the virtue of being honest. There were awkward moments, friends who remembered the scandal that pushed her away, whispers from old contacts who were careful now not to be entangled in investigations. But the ledger she had kept in her head, the one with 2 columns labeled survival and dignity, began to rebalance. She could do the work she had trained for and ensure her family's bills were paid. That had a quiet, steady worth. One evening, some months on, Zora walked back into Ristorante Bellavita and saw the Don seated in his usual place. He had been summoned again. His lawyers had been involved. He kept to himself now, guarded. He did not smile across the room the way he once had. He moved like a man recalibrated by paperwork, more cautious, more than cruel. He caught sight of Zora, and for an instant he looked at her the way predators look when they remember they've been clipped. Her reply that night had frozen him, and the slow accumulation of legal pressure had frozen him further. There was no dramatic apology, because such men rarely offer them. There was something quieter, an acknowledgement in the slump of his shoulders. He had been unmasked and then managed to hide behind counsel. Institutions did their work in steps. They were not cinematic. But they had a persistence. Men who thought themselves absolute often didn't account for. Zora's last night shift of that week ended with a small, ordinary triumph. Lorraine's nurse had called earlier with news of a new, more manageable medication schedule. Malcolm had texted a picture of himself idling with friends between classes, a grin that seemed to say he could breathe. Zora walked home through city streets glinting with wet light, her jacket collar up against a colder wind. She thought of the Don's watch at the table, and the way a single, carefully chosen phrase had unmoored the performance he had relied on for so long. She sat at her kitchen table, the light low, and took out a small pile of papers, bank statements that showed corrected transfers, a note from a program that had helped pick up Lorraine's expenses, a letter thanking her for her cooperation with an investigation. They were not dramatic, but they meant something. They were the practical proofs of a different life axis. In a short epilogue that was not melodramatic but quietly right, she took a call from Elias Hart. He asked if she'd be willing to be a consultant on another case, small at first, translating dialects, tracking suppliers, reading minutiae on shipping manifests. It wasn't a reinstatement to the diplomatic post she had known, but it was something solid. She accepted. The work would mean time away, but it also promised the ability to be useful again and to be paid for it. The ledger, once tilted, began to even out more each month. On the new job, she was measured with respect. Her role was no show, no applause, but a quiet recognition that competence had weight in rooms that had previously been only theater. And every now and then, when she passed Ristorante Bellavita and saw the Don at his table, she felt neither fear nor triumph so much as a practical satisfaction. He had tried that evening to be loud and small, and to pin her, like a label on cheap linen. He had attempted the instrument of humiliation, an old power play that uses language as a lash. Instead, he had been given a mirror and then served legal filings shaped by people with patience and forms and references. It was not retribution in the movie sense. It was a restoration of scales that had been skewed. When people asked about that night later, when they pieced together a clip of him speaking in a dialect to humiliate a server, many got the anecdote wrong, polishing it with new adjectives. The truth had none of the glamour of a chase scene. It did have, however, one precise image that held as a kind of emblem, the Don frozen after her reply, the way a man who thinks himself unshakable had to sit and measure the taste of his humiliation. And after that, the paperwork did the rest. If this comeback made your day, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves seeing the underestimated win.